Hey folks, Erick Stakelbeck here. Welcome to a special New Year's Eve edition of the Watchman Newscast. Happy New Year to everyone. I'm just wishing all of you and your loved ones many blessings in the year 2021. God bless you. I'm sure that all of us are pretty eager to see the calendar flip from 2020 to 2021. Obviously, this was a very difficult year. We saw a lot of unwelcome changes. But in some respects, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And in terms of what we are discussing today on the newscast, that's not a good thing, unfortunately. Once again, in 2020, the UN came after Israel, passing 17 resolutions against Israel. That's 3 times more than any other nation in 2020, all passed against the nation of Israel. We're going to get into it in a minute. Before I do, I just want to encourage you to subscribe to the Watchman News channel right here on YouTube and click the notification bell so you get alerts every time a new video is posted. Hey, we're bringing you the kind of cutting-edge, timely information that you just won't hear anywhere else, certainly not in the mainstream media. What happens in the Middle East does not stay in the Middle East. It profoundly affects all of us, no matter where we live around the world. And that's why we are serving as watchmen on the wall for you right here on YouTube. So be sure to subscribe. Okay, let's get into it. A great organization called UN Watch. You can check them out at unwatch.org. They released their annual report last week. This is an organization that is devoted to monitoring anti-Israel bias at the UN. So they're quite busy, to say the least. They released their annual report, and they laid out that the UN in 2020, the UN General Assembly, the complete body of nations there, passed 17 resolutions against Israel and only 6 against other nations. Now, that's more resolutions against Israel than Iran, North Korea, China, Cuba, Syria, all against Israel, which is a beacon of freedom and democracy and hope in a sea of tyranny in the Middle East. Yet the UN has a bullseye on the back of the Jewish state. Let's get into some of the ugly details here. I just want to read to you directly from this UN Watch report. Here's an example of the absurdity of some of these resolutions. By the way, 2 of them were passed just last week with only 1 week left in 2020, late December. The UN passed 2 of these resolutions. One of them is titled Oil Slick on Lebanese Shores, and it condemns Israel over an alleged, keyword there, 2006 incident during that war, summer 2006 war between Israel and the terror group Hezbollah, an alleged incident in which I guess oil was on the shores of Lebanon, or oil somehow. There was an oil slick, and of course it's all Israel's fault. So this was one of the resolutions, something that happened 14 and a half years ago and is an alleged incident. The UN General Assembly nonetheless condemns Israel for it with a resolution. And here's the numbers, folks. Get this. This bogus resolution passed with 162 countries supporting it. That's nearly the entire UN. 7 opposing it, including the United States, of course, and 6 abstaining. Not giving a vote one way or the other. 162 nations voting to condemn Israel over an alleged oil slick on Lebanese shores 14 and a half years ago that happened in the middle of a war between Israel and Hezbollah. This gives you a window into the absurdity of what's happening at the UN right now. Here's some more of the details. Now, as I mentioned, 17 resolutions against Israel in 2020 alone. And by the way, this fits with a pattern at the UN, folks. Since 1948, when Israel was miraculously reborn, there have been more resolutions passed against Israel, hundreds, in fact, than against any other nation. In the history of the UN, there's been more resolutions passed against Israel, more than, again, China, North Korea, Iran, Syria, Cuba, etc. The other votes this year, out of the 23 resolutions passed at the UN General Assembly, 17 against Israel. The other 6 were against North Korea, Iran, Syria, Myanmar, which is a military dictatorship, and 2 were on Crimea, which obviously Russia seized back in 2014. So Israel is grouped in with the Iranian regime, North Korea, Syria, a military dictatorship, not only grouped in with them, but considered above and beyond these nations, 3 times as many resolutions against Israel than against these other notorious dictatorships. This is the situation we have at the UN right now. Here's a direct quote from Hillel Neuer. He's the executive director of UN Watch, which again, we encourage you to check out unwatch.org, doing important work. He says the UN's assault on Israel with a torrent of one-sided resolutions is surreal. Good way to describe it. He says it's absurd that in the year 2020, out of a total 23 of UN General Assembly resolutions that criticize countries, 17 of them, more than 70%, were focused on one single country, Israel. Make no mistake, he says, the purpose of the lopsided condemnations is to demonize the Jewish state. Very clear. Again, this is the UN General Assembly giving their stamp of approval. And here's another key point he makes. What about Europe? With all of these resolutions, right? Europe, which is supposedly democratic, freedom-minded, a Western nations, the cradle of Western civilization, supposedly aligned with Israel in terms of Judeo-Christian civilization, Europe voted for the majority of these resolutions. A majority of European nations voted for these anti-Israel resolutions. To say that's troubling is an understatement, to say the least. Here's what Hillel Neuer says about it. We note that the UK and EU states like France, Germany, and Spain voted yes to more than 2/3 of these United Nations General Assembly resolutions singling out Israel in 2020. This is insane, folks. Yet these same nations failed to introduce a single resolution this year on the human rights situation in China, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Belarus, Cuba, Turkey, Pakistan, Vietnam, Algeria, or on 175 other countries. A complete fixation on Israel. Very interesting. Now, this harkens back to 2016. Do you remember December 23rd, Christmas Eve, 2016, that notorious resolution condemning Israel at the UN, condemning so-called Israeli settlements in the biblical heartland of Judea and Samaria, where the Obama administration abstained and allowed the resolution to pass. It was a stunning moment, to say the least. It was a kick out the door by the Obama administration against Israel before President Trump came into office. Obviously, to my mind, the most pro-Israel president in American history. I think that's pretty clear from top to bottom what he's done over the past 4 years. There's a real concern that a President Biden would not be very friendly and would hearken back to the Obama days. Remember, Joe Biden was the vice president under Barack Obama when that notorious resolution was allowed to pass, was not blocked by the United States back in 2016. Also, to just give you an idea of the absurdity over all of this, our November 5th newscast, check it out under newscasts here on our YouTube channel under November 5th. We talked about what happened on November 4th. It was actually the day previous, where the UN passed 7 resolutions against Israel in one day on November 4th, 2020, including one denying any Jewish presence on the Temple Mount, where Jesus taught, chased out the money changers, where the Temple of Solomon and Herod's temple both stood. The UN calls it Haram al-Sharif by its Muslim name and denies any Jewish claim, historical claim to the Temple Mount or to Jerusalem in general, really. So this is what you're looking at the UN. You know, you think of the book of Zechariah where it says that Jerusalem will become a burdensome stone and any nation that comes against it will be cut to pieces. You see that lining up right now where the nations of the world are lining up with these anti-Israel resolutions. You might say, okay, what do these resolutions do? What's the big deal? They're more symbolic. Folks, it sends a message and it sets a bad precedent of anti-Israel animus among the nations of the world. At the UN, the largest global body, of course, it just continues to set this anti-Israel tone and singles Israel out. And it's interesting and ironic, I guess you would say, because at the same time, Israel is less isolated than it's ever been. I look at the growing relationships between Israel and India, which is obviously the world's largest democracy. Very important relationship there. Very important relationships that Israel is forming in Africa, in Latin America. Obviously, the relationship with the United States over the past 4 years, at least, has been very strong. And of course, in the Arab world, the Sunni Arab nations, the Abraham Accords, and these peace agreements that Israel has struck with Bahrain, the UAE, Morocco, and Sudan. And there's more in the offing, most likely, in 2021 with Saudi Arabia and others. So on one hand, you'd say, wow, Israel is less isolated and more accepted by the nations of the world than ever before. But these nations, if they are true friends of Israel, and I'm talking about these Abraham Accords nations in particular, now that you have this warm peace, and hey, with the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco, the expectations are it's going to be a very warm peace between Israel and these nations. It's time to step up at the UN and vote no on these resolutions. Whether you're a Sunni Arab nation, particularly Europe, it's time to vote no, have some spine, take a stand, and really make a stand with Israel at the UN. Again, at the end of the day, these resolutions are largely symbolic, but man, what a cesspool when Iran, North Korea are largely getting a pass, and all of the onus and the focus is on Israel. So the more things change, the more they stay the same in 2020. And I had to chuckle a few times here while I was reading, not because I think this is not a big deal, but because the absurdity of it all, right, folks? What else can you say? 17 resolutions against Israel and only one against Iran, one against North Korea, Syria, serial human rights abusers, terrorist supporters. But Israel, that's the real problem, according to the UN. Hey, we hope this changes. At the UN, it's pretty much stayed the same, unfortunately, since 1948. More resolutions against Israel than any other nation. But we hope perhaps in 2021 there is a wake-up call, because miracles do happen, right? So we'll see. We'll continue to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. We'll pray for wisdom and discernment and justice and fairness among the world's leaders, that the scales are lifted from their eyes and they see that Israel is not the problem in the Middle East. Israel is the solution in the Middle East. And we'll hope there's that wake-up call in 2021. Hey, Happy New Year again to everyone. We had a big year here on the Watchman YouTube channel. Of course, we've got our weekly TV show on TBN every Thursday night, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And you can catch full episodes here on our YouTube channel. But hey, we started this year with 50,000 subscribers. As we close, we are approaching 138,000 subscribers nearly. So wow, big jump, nearly 88,000 subscribers in 1 year. And we believe much more to come in 2021. And we're just going to continue to bring you the truth for such a time as this that you will not hear anywhere else. Be encouraged for 2021. Hey, I think many of the things that went down in 2021 and we started to see developing will intensify in 2021. Let's not kid ourselves, but one of our mottos here on the Watchman Newscast is God still sits on the throne. He is in charge. So put your faith in him. Be strong and courageous. I think of Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11, where God says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future." So hold on to that. Hold on to Jesus. In 2021, we'll get through it together, folks. And with God in our corner, we will be just fine. Happy New Year. We'll see you again soon. God bless you. And remember, never hold your peace.